Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our very first webinar. Krista, I don't know if we've ever done one of these before, but we are rolling out a summer webinar series. We simply want to help people connect around issues that are important to community. On our website, we have a link for 5 other webinars, which we're going to be offering this summer, but we really appreciate your time that you're able to join us. My name is Michael Johnny. I manage York's Knowledge Mobilization Unit. At a high level, our unit is all about helping make research relevant to society. We've had the pleasure of working for many years with researchers and community leaders in areas of food security, food councils, and food access. And we're really honored to have Professor Rod MacRae lead our session today. Rod has been a food policy analyst with 35 years experience. He's provided extensive consultation and advice for various levels of government, business, and NGOs around advancing food systems in Canada. He is an associate professor within the Faculty of Environmental Studies, which after July 1st, I believe is going to have a new name.
Yes.
And his area of focus is around design and implementation of a national food policy for Canada. A couple quick process items before we get started. This session is being recorded and we'll provide access to this on our website. If anybody else is seeking a copy, feel free to reach out to it. I am going to manage the chat function, which I'm guilty of treating as a bit of a stream of consciousness. So I'm open to kind of side conversations, but I would please ask if we could hold our questions until the end. I'll turn on the microphones, try and keep a bit of a speakers list, but we'll have some time to connect with Rod. At a high level, we're just seeking to help people connect. When we send out an evaluation around this, we'll be looking to see if you're comfortable sharing your email address with all the participants, perhaps opening up other opportunities for engagement and collaboration. There we go. I am done. I will pass things over to Rod. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome everybody. Hope you find this session useful. As Michael said, the topic is food councils and food security, and one of the reasons I find this such an interesting topic is that food security, of course, is a huge problem globally, locally, and everything in between. And food councils have been really critical to the discussion and actions that have been undertaken in Canada the last couple of decades. But it's kind of a paradoxical situation because most food councils are very local and actually have very limited authority within the food system to actually create the kinds of changes they're interested in creating. So we'll explore that a little bit today. I'll give some context for how these council or the environment in which these councils are functioning. And then I'll quickly summarize what we've found in our work and our research are the critical elements of success. If these things are going to work well, what do they have to have structurally in terms of their composition and their agenda? What are the things they have to be able to do well in order to succeed in what is often a very complex environment? So a little bit of context, and then we'll jump into the way these things function. So for most of human agricultural history, this is really what the food system looked like, right? It was a very closed loop kind of scenario where production, consumption, and recycling of whatever we didn't consume, whatever waste products we generated, including human waste, all those things were recycled and became nutrients for the next phase of the production process. So super local, like way more local than now, obviously, because what we have now looks more like this. It's completely chaotic, unbelievably complex, with millions and millions of actors, billions of exchanges on a global basis, a hugely difficult thing to manage. And essentially, fundamentally, it is unmanaged and unmanageable. It operates by a particular set of rules that are mostly defined by market dynamics, with some levels of government intervention to try and smooth out the rough edges of market misbehavior. But it's a hugely complex system. So here you have the paradoxical situation where these local food councils are operating within a global food system context, which would seem to be impossible on one level. Yet what's happened, of course, is that because this system is so crazy, it's created all kinds of demand for local interventions and localization of the food system itself. So that creates new opportunities for these councils to function and be successful. Now, there are numerous definitions of food security. I think there's something like 60 of them in the literature. So food security itself can sometimes feel like a hard thing to pin down, but I like to use a concept developed by my colleagues at Ryerson's Center for Studies in Food Security called the 5 A's of food security. And those 5 A's are that food is available, in other words, there's a sufficient supply, that it's accessible, that the distribution of food is equal and effective and efficient, that it's acceptable culturally and nutritionally adequate, that it's appropriate, in other words, it's ecologically sustainable and safe. And the 5th A, which is the main reason I really like their definition, is agency. In other words, does the system, the food system, enable individual and collective community action to effect positive change? And this is really where these local councils, food councils, are operating. They're really acting as these agents of agency, if you will, and I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. Now, as I mentioned, and of course many would know, food insecurity is a huge problem at many different scales. So one of the things we always have to think about when talking about food security and food insecurity is what level in the system are we talking about? And of course, then you get different kinds of problems depending on what the level is. So at the household level, for example, in Canada, 1 person in 8 can't afford a nourishing diet, which is a horrendous statistic. At a community level, we have these phenomena called food deserts and food swamps. A food desert would be a scenario where there's very limited access to affordable, nourishing food through the dominant grocery store system. And Toronto and many other communities in Canada do relatively well on this score compared, say, to the United States, but there still are these pockets of what are called food deserts. And food swamps are sort of the opposite. The food swamp scenario, which is very common in many communities, is where you've got way too ready access to junk. In other words, non-nourishing foods that are readily available and are conveniently located to take advantage of impulse buys. At a regional level, there are equally many kinds of food insecurity problems. So for example, Ontario has a $20 billion food deficit annually. Now this seems kind of crazy in a province that's such a big food producer, but in fact, we're importing $20 billion more than we're exporting. And about half of that is foods that we do produce, store, and process locally for various parts of the year, but we're not optimizing our own infrastructure. And often the same foods that we produce are being imported. And of course, everybody talks about things like, why can't I get local strawberries? And how come the strawberries are coming in from California in the middle of our local strawberry season? So that's a specific example of a larger phenomenon, which is this food deficit. And of course, as we've seen with COVID, there are questions about the viability of the food supply when we're relying a lot on imported foods. And at a national level, about 30% of what we consume in this country is imported. And it's particularly fruits, vegetables, and processed goods. And of course, fruits and vegetables, unfortunately, are also the areas that we underconsume to the greatest degree. So they're very critical to health, obviously, and yet we underconsume them, and we underproduce them, and we over-import them. So you can imagine the kinds of complexities that can arise related to this if imported supply chains are restricted. And of course, the other terribly horrendous statistic in all this is at an international scale is 820 million people are hungry, even though we produce enough calories, enough food to feed the world. So it's not a production problem, it's primarily a distribution problem. So again, this is the context in which a lot of these food councils are trying to function. And another key piece of the context for these local councils is the need for what's called joined up food policy. And again, because of the complexity in the system, and because so little of it is actually regulated properly or coordinated or facilitated or animated properly, we need food policy that creates a framework and a mandate and an implementation plan for solving food system problems. So really what we have to have is a coherent, consistent, substantial, and comprehensive policy environment that links the functions of our food system and its behavior to higher order goals of health promotion, equity, and environmental sustainability. So these are the kinds of goals that a lot of the food councils are after, but they don't really exist currently in the system. And there's no policy environment in Canada that's really effective at driving these things forward. I'm going to show you in a few minutes a slide about the national food policy that was just announced last year, but it doesn't actually achieve those goals of health promotion, equity, and environmental sustainability, unfortunately. Now, to be charitable, creating a joined up food policy is a complex agenda, right? It requires significant changes to the status quo, the way the current food system functions. There are so many actors and processes and linkages involved in the system. And as I've said, the food system is enormously diverse and complicated, which means there are many targets that have to be hit if we want to change things, and it's going to take time. We don't have much of a revolutionary history in Canada, especially around food system change, so this is not going to be a fast process. And although often the goals are clear, the pathways to achieve them are often highly disputed by all these different actors that exist in the system. And for many, they have contested ideas about what sustainability and health looks like. So the endpoints are often hard to pin down precisely. So again, these are part of the challenges in trying to do this kind of work. Now, here I'll introduce everybody's favorite topic, the Canadian Constitution. Unfortunately, we do need to understand the Constitution as part of the process of understanding what these local food councils can and cannot do, and how they try to get around the rules, so to speak, in a lot of their functions. So the main piece of the Canadian Constitution, the British North America Act, the BNA Act of 1867, and what it did was it gave to the federal government certain kinds of powers, criminal law power, which explains a lot of how our food safety system is constructed. A lot of the food safety rules in this country are really designed around an anti-fraud framework because they're attached to the criminal law power. And it's also often used as justification for environmental protection measures. But unfortunately, because it's rooted in the criminal law, it kind of limits the sort of interventions that the federal government is prepared to undertake. But that's the one they have to use because that's the law, that's what the Constitution was about. Remember, 1867, a lot of the things we now understand about food and food systems, there was very little understanding of that in those days. So the Constitution wasn't really constructed in a way that is optimal for trying to deal with today's problems. Another key power under the BNA Act is what's called the Peace, Order, and Good Government provision, or the POG. And it's used to justify the federal government intervening within things that are normally considered provincial jurisdiction. And we've seen that, for example, with the carbon tax most recently, but it's been done regularly over the years by the federal government to try and legitimately say, well, if we're going to do something, we have to do it in a coordinated fashion across the country, and that's our justification for doing something that would normally be considered provincial. Another power is the trade and commerce across borders power, and this explains why the federal government is so focused on food exports. And of course, another critical one is taxation for at least income and border taxes, but not property and education, which are considered provincial jurisdiction. And because it has taxation authority, it also then has spending power. So the federal government will often use its money, its spending power, to try and convince provinces to do certain things. Now, the provinces were also given certain kinds of powers under the Constitution. Agriculture, although it's shared with the federal government, it's primarily provincial authority. Environment is primarily provincial. Development, conservation, and management of non-renewable natural resources is all largely provincial. Excuse me. Property is provincial, and that explains why the provinces and then of course the municipalities, because the provinces hand off a lot of authority on this to the municipalities, why land use is organized the way it is across the country. Social, education, and health policy are all considered provincial, although the BNA Act didn't really articulate a lot of these things very well. It talked about things like schools, hospitals, prisons, asylums, and charitable institutions. And the word health actually doesn't even appear in the BNA Act. So these things are considered provincial, but they're defined in ways that are suboptimal for what we're trying to do these days. And transportation is a shared jurisdiction. The federal government has control over modes of interprovincial and international transportation, but it has given the provinces control of a lot of the road networks. The navigable waters are federal, but bizarrely, the water beds under a lot of those waters are provincial. So you can imagine the kind of conflicts that that creates. And the provinces have authority within their own boundaries. So by highlighting this, what I'm getting at is that the Constitution is a mess for our purposes. We're trying to change the food system. And it makes it very difficult often for advocates for change to figure out who are the actors who actually have authority over any particular realm, and what kinds of interventions, therefore, can they undertake given their powers under the Constitution. So this is something that constantly confronts a lot of food councils. So if we look quickly then with a few examples at who does what across federal and provincial and municipal jurisdictions, if we're looking at, say, nutrition policy and programming, the federal government has some policy and programs and funds and research, but this is considered a largely provincial jurisdiction because it's connected to health. And so the provinces are responsible for the delivery of things like public health nutrition. But really what they do is they hand a lot of that work off to the municipalities. So the municipalities are actually doing the delivery through things like public health units. Preventing market fraud, well, the federal government has competition rules. The Competition Act is the main piece of legislation. And as I mentioned, a lot of its work is designed around anti-fraud, fraud prevention, because a lot of the early work on food was really concerned with snake oil, you know, preventing the classic snake oil salesman from selling things that were fraudulent. This is back in, for example, the 1890s when a lot of this early legislation was constructed. So that's federal jurisdiction, but the provinces have responsibility for a lot of business licensing and enforcement. But they allocate certain limited bits of that to the municipalities. So the municipalities do some licensing and inspection, but based on authority given by the provinces, because of course municipalities in the Canadian system are instruments of the province. The Constitution Act gave the provinces the authority to set up municipalities, essentially. Meat inspection, the federal government sets standards and enforcement for cross-border meat. In other words, if meat is being slaughtered and then cut and packed for a cross-border shipment, then the meat has to meet federal standards. If it's all happening within the province, in other words, the meat isn't going across a border, then it's considered provincial internal trade and provincial rules can be applied. But many of the provinces have decided to use the federal rules anyway. And then municipalities, again, have some limited jurisdiction in this area, particularly for inspection of restaurants and some retail outlets as it relates to meat. And the fourth example is what are called environmental farm plans, or EFPs. And this is a pillar of federal environmental programming in the agricultural sector. And the federal government has designed a national model in consultation with the provinces. And they provide a lot of the funding. It's usually 60% federal funding, 40% provincial, to help with environmental farm plan adoption by farmers. But the provinces usually do delivery. And in fact, often they even contract it out to a third-party organization that's outside of government. And here's a case where really the municipalities, except a few regional municipalities on the prairies, really they don't have much of a role in environmental farm planning. So again, I think I'm hoping you'll get a sense here of the way in which all these things are divided, and the unfortunate reality is that a lot of things end up falling through the cracks. And of course, in a way, the most bizarre part of this story is that the municipalities, which are, as we've always known, sort of the closest to the action, they're the closest to the citizenry. They see on the ground that more readily than the other levels of government what the problems are, but they actually have the least authority in the system to do anything about those problems. Now, I mentioned that there is a national food policy finally. I mean, we've been waiting in a way for 100 years for a national food policy to be created. It was announced about this time last year, so June of 2019. The federal government has called it Everyone at the Table. And the vision of the new policy is that all people in Canada are able to access a sufficient amount of safe, nutritious, and culturally diverse food. Canada's food system is resilient and innovative, sustains our environment, and supports our economy. As vision statements go, this is decidedly better than what we've had in the past. So this is a significant improvement. There are still weaknesses in this kind of vision statement, but it's better than what we've seen in previous iterations. And there are some good priority outcomes that have been identified and some good guiding principles. But the fundamental problem with the national food policy is that there's no way to deliver on it with the projects and programs they've announced so far. So they've essentially only announced $134 million in new funding over 5 years, and a lot of that funding has no real details yet on its design, and there's no indication at this point that there's going to be any significant regulatory and legislative change to help deliver on this vision. So as often happens with Canadian food system change proposals, is that they look good on paper, but they don't actually deliver when it comes to actually doing the implementation. Okay, so those are my contextual pieces, and now I want to talk a little bit about these food councils that again are largely local, local municipality, regional municipality based. And when we did a study back in 2013 and an extensive survey, we found that there were 64 of them. So these numbers might not be accurate right now. There are probably a few more. There might be a few that have disappeared. So I'm still assuming there's probably in the range of 60 of these organizations across the country. And they fit within a network of roughly 280 across North America. In other words, there's about 220 in the United States. So this is really an extensive phenomena. And again, most of this has really happened in the last 20, 25 years. Now, what's interesting about these things is that they use a range of organizational forms to advance food system change work, and I'll show you a bit more on that in a moment. And they're trying to move beyond the traditional responsibilities I'm talking about, food inspection, licensing, nutrition, to a fuller sense of the role of food in cities. And of course, one of our dilemmas here is that a lot of city planners have not historically seen food as part of their mission, again, leaving it to other levels of government to take care of. But that hasn't worked. And so, again, part of the reason these food councils exist is because they see the problems of food in cities, the food insecurity problems, the environmental problems. And so they're preoccupied with issues like affordable access and urban design and transportation, sustainable production and distribution, food as economic development, food and education, food and culture, food and social cohesion. So these are the kinds of things that a lot of these food councils want to be engaged in. And yet, as I say, how to do that is often a challenge given that they don't have authority, and the municipality that they might be trying to influence doesn't have necessarily authority in these domains either. But food system change also allows for the advancement of other kinds of priorities like community safety, climate change, pollution reduction, and recreation. And that is actually a fundamentally important piece, which I'll come back to later. So these food councils, or food policy councils as they're often called, They have certain core functions. They have discussions of food issues. They're trying to balance the interests of various actors, government, business, nonprofits. They create opportunities for collaboration across sectors. So they're trying to break down some of the silos that exist in the system, whether they be government silos or whether they be market-based silos. And particularly a lot of them focus on trying to help resolve what is seen as a rural-urban divide. They analyze, influence, and create policy, but they also create or support existing programs and services, including doing fundraising, program design and execution, and advocacy work. Now in Canada, you can see from this chart, which starts in 1990 and goes up to about 2010, that although there were some early ones, the Toronto Food Policy Council was the first one in Canada from 1990. But really the majority of the activity has really happened since the mid-2000s. And from about 2006, there was a significant explosion in the numbers of these food policy organizations that were being created across the country. And they do exist in all parts of Canada. Every province has activity in this domain, but Ontario and British Columbia have by far the largest numbers of them, as you can see from the graphic here. Now, one of the things we wanted to do was get a better sense of their structures, because these things are so diverse, their structures and how the structural elements may be contributing or not contributing to their success. So we ended up organizing these food policy councils into 6 main categories, and I'll quickly review them here and there's a few examples, as you can see in the chart, of different ones in different parts of the country. The first category is those that are actually completely organized by the municipality and municipal staff. So they are run by the municipality. This is obviously the strongest level of municipal support. And when we did the survey back in 2013, Edmonton, Calgary, and Metro Vancouver all fell into this category. The second category is where you've got a hybrid. You've got a civil society organization, CSO, and government hybrid that has a conduit to the municipal council, to the politicians, and municipal financing. And it has political champions and dedicated or supportive staff to implement strategies. So the City of Toronto, the City of Vancouver, and Markham were all examples of this particular structural arrangement. The third category is like the previous one, but without government staff and financing, or they do have a conduit through the departments through in-kind means. So there may be in-kind staff who are seconded to the Food Policy Council to do certain kinds of activities, and there may be some in-kind financial support, but there's no direct funding of dedicated staff and dedicated financing from the municipality as there is in Category 2. Huntsville, Waterloo region, Kamloops would be examples in this category. The fourth category, and again, as you can see, we're getting weaker and weaker in terms of the level of municipal support as we go down the chart. The fourth category, the conduit to decision makers, is only through secondary agencies, perhaps social service agencies and their staff, with some grant financing from governments, but no regular financing. So Montreal, the GTA, Agricultural Action Committee, Saskatoon were all examples of this model back in 2013. The fifth one, there are government officials who sit on the round table, the Food Council round table, or the project committees, but there's limited government funding and participation in implementation. So this is actually in the biggest category. What we found in our survey was this category 5 with 16 different food policy organizations. Caslo, BC, Sudbury, Ontario, Gatineau, Quebec were examples. And then the weakest category in terms of municipal support, there is really no government involvement. It's completely run by NGOs. And this is also a significantly large category: Okanagan, Winnipeg, St. John's, Newfoundland. In many ways, it struck us that a lot of organizations are sort of trying to move up the chart, if you will. They're trying to move up closer and closer to Category 2. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So what did we find were the favorable organizational components? A formal link to the political level, it turned out, is pretty critical. You can't just sustain yourself with grant funding and voluntary contributions from NGOs. NGO involvement is obviously critical, but without a formal link to the political level, it becomes very difficult to channel and funnel your proposals into the political system with any hope of successful implementation. Dedicated staff that report to a civil service, often public health or social development, turned out to be also critical. Having some kind of an established budget that allows the food policy organization to then help other organizations with fundraising is also essential. Having both elected official and non-elected champions, so having people at city council, for example, who really like what you're doing and are prepared to help steer your proposals through city council, but also then having leaders within the NGO community and even the business community that really like what the council is trying to achieve. A diverse membership of both traditional and non-traditional actors with expertise and linkages within their sector is very important. So sometimes people think, well, you've really got to narrow who's around the table and narrow the focus. But we've found that it actually is very critical to have a food system orientation, to have a broad analytical approach, a broad set of issues that you're concerned about, but then obviously you have to be very strategic within that broad set of that broad agenda. You have to be very strategic about what you spend your time and money on. So given those structural pieces, there were some other elements that were important for success. Bringing together people who don't normally talk, and that's really one of the major strengths of these bodies, is that people who don't normally talk to each other get together, realize they have more common cause than they probably thought they did, and then some creative ideas start to emerge as they spend more time together. We found it was important to do something like a food system assessment of your community or your municipality, and even create a food charter, which is basically a policy statement, and then to go back and forth between policy and action. In other words, policies need actions to bring them to reality, to bring them to life, and actions need a policy framework in order to be legitimate. So the really successful bodies would go back and forth between policy and action. It was important to have a win while developing a long-term local food system expertise. Understanding the needs and priorities of host agencies was critical. Being able to gradually strengthen these structural connections to local government. As I said, a lot of them were trying to move up the category. If they were a category 4 or 5, they were trying to progressively move up to category 3 or 2. Not that that's easy always, but that was really what a lot of them were trying to do. As I mentioned, you want to be able to link food and food issues to existing reports and policies, because food can help solve many other problems. And a lot of policymakers and decision makers are looking for ideas. And a food policy council was often seen to be valuable because it was providing new, fresh ideas about how to solve both food problems, but then other problems that the municipality was struggling with at the same time. Critical to work across the political spectrum, so there's support regardless of who's in power. And it was important to work provincially and federally, but only once some local successes were in place. We're not going to spend much time on this, but I'll just give you a visual sense of the scope of these organizations, the range of people that they work with, the kind of actions that they were undertaking, dozens and dozens of different kinds of projects and policy interventions, and ultimately the wide range of municipal departments that they were involved in trying to influence and work with for various kinds of project successes. And as I mentioned, working nationally and provincially was important, but that required then being able to master the indirect strategy to try and use municipal powers to influence other levels of government, because food councils themselves and often the municipality don't, as I say, don't have the authority to implement a lot of the kinds of changes they might want to see. Those are really provincial and federal jurisdiction. senior levels of government like to see on the ground successes, and that's why it was important to have some local successes first. That builds up your credentials and your reputation, and then allowed senior levels to treat you with a greater degree of respect and pay more attention to your proposals. It was critical to know where the decisions are really being made. A lot of the time we think decisions are political layer decisions, but in the food system, a lot of them are actually civil service decisions. So it was important to understand those realities, to make new friends, but to be ready to play the embarrassment card if required. There are a lot more friends in the system than we often think there are. It's just that they don't necessarily know what the right thing is to do. So it becomes part of the role of these food councils to help people understand what the right thing is. A lot of them were participating or planning to participate in what are now what is now the National Food Policy, but originally they were, when we did the study, they were participating in the upcoming National Food Policy consultations. And I think based on what emerged in that policy that I just told you about a few moments ago, is that these food councils had a significant influence on the design of the new food policy. And now, because the federal government has said they're going to create a national food policy organization, they've solicited membership requests. They haven't announced anything yet. The thing isn't functioning. It's probably delayed because of COVID-19. But an interesting question is whether these local food policy councils can link to the national one. It's not embedded in the existing design, unfortunately, but there may be an opportunity to create such linkages if this thing gets off the ground. So that's all I'll say at this point. If you're interested in these topics, there are two particular websites you might want to go to. I'll leave this last slide up. One is called, the report we did was called Municipal Food Policy Entrepreneurs, and it's on the website of the Toronto Food Policy Council. And I have a website called Food Policy for Canada, and it's foodpolicyforcanada.info.yorku.ca if you want to take a look at that. And there I go into significant detail about what the change agenda looks like. So thanks for listening and look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Rod. What I'm going to do, we're a pretty manageable crowd. I'm going to go through and open up everybody's microphone. But while we were talking, we had a question from somebody who may have had to leave right now. So I will read that right now. The question is, curious, what does Dr. MacRae think about neoliberalism and capitalism's role in our food system and what to do about it?
Well, that's a big agenda, obviously, to change neoliberalism and capitalism, but they are at the root of many of our dilemmas. Essentially, the market economy in food doesn't work properly. The price signals are all messed up. There's all kinds of market failure in the system. And a lot of the interventions that need to come from governments really relate to how are we going to fix a lot of these market failures in the system. In the longer term, one can argue, we might need to completely transform the capitalist food enterprise. If you are interested in this topic, you can go to my website, foodpolicyforcanada.info.yorku.ca, and there I talk about the long-term redesign agenda to really return food to the public realm. I mean, we've got this crazy situation where, food, air, and water are the three biological requirements for most organism survival. And for humans, we treat air and water still as public goods. We don't always treat them well as public goods, but you don't have to reach into your pocket and take out money to drink water and breathe necessarily. But you do primarily for food because most of us aren't in a position of being able to self-provision. So food is primarily a private sector function, even though it's so critical to human survival. And in the long term, we're going to have to change that. Food will have to be a public good once again, but that's not going to happen fast. But my website has some proposals under the redesign category on how we could make that happen.
Thank you, Rod. To let everybody know, I've opened up your microphone. I know that most of you have it muted, which is fabulous and appreciated. Jane, you've mentioned you have a question and your mic is open if you wish to share your question right now.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. And hi, Rod. It's Jane Wadlock here.
Hi, Jane.
Hi. Nice to hear you again.
You too.
So my question is, are there some key things that you think, opportunities for local food councils as a result of what has been unearthed through COVID-19?
Well, in theory, there should be lots of opportunities because, of course, there's a whole lot of discussion going on about how COVID has exposed these vulnerabilities in the food system that we've known about for a long time, but they've obviously become more apparent during the pandemic. So in theory, I would say yes. The big issue in my mind is whether decision makers, because they're so preoccupied with the current crisis, once that crisis is over, what will their mindset be? Will they be in a position of saying, okay, obviously a lot of things aren't working and we've got to fix them for the longer term? Or are they going to say, oh, phew, that's over, let's just go back to the way things were? Because of course we know that the food system has many entrenched interests. A lot of actors are doing very nicely with the way the system is currently organized, and it's not necessarily in their interest to change things, but there may have been enough disruption in the dominant system that even the dominant actors will realize that things have to be done differently. So there's the opportunity in theory. Whether we can turn it into something real, that's the big question mark in my mind.
Okay, thank you.
Here we've got a question from Sarah, so feel free to jump right in.
Hi, Rod. It's Sarah Rotz.
Hi, Sarah.
I was just had a question for you about kind of similar to the previous question. I suppose I'm wondering what you think about the extent to which that the sort of council governance structure could intervene on things like what we're seeing with the migrant labor issue. Like, can it attend to those kinds of larger issues? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where they're located, obviously. I mean, one of the problems for a lot of big city councils is that their intervention in agricultural related issues, for example, like agricultural worker conditions, the agriculture community doesn't consider them generally to be legitimate interveners in those kinds of discussions. But often if your council is operating in a more rural area, there may then be those kinds of opportunities, particularly through linkages to the public health apparatus. So I think the main leverage point is probably going to be through public health, because of course, as we know, so many of the conditions for farm workers are really bad, and it's going to probably be up to public health to put a lot of pressure on other places in the system to change those conditions. And the ability of these local councils to then convince their public health connections that this is an important agenda will be fundamental to any successes that happen there. On a wider angle, you know, one of the big issues is that Canada does not have a really coherent food system labor force development strategy. It never has had. I mean, for 50 years, the strategy in Canada as it relates to food system laborers across all kinds of sectors, not just agriculture, but processing and a whole bunch of other domains. The strategy from governments has been, if we can't find the workers domestically, we'll just import them. And that's obviously a failure and really exposed under the current conditions. So the bigger issue is, can we get a coherent food system labor force development strategy? And there are some people who are working on that. So in terms of policy change, that's maybe some place where a number of food councils could have some kind of a larger impact.
Thank you very much. I've got Yvonne Kelly up next with a question.
Great, thanks, Michael. Nice to see you, Rod. It seems like it's 100 years ago since I was in Toronto, and my first question is, my first comment is, I've never seen you without a hat on, so this is interesting. So my question is about capacity building for smaller and maybe those higher category but lower level of capacity food policy councils. So having had the experience of participating in a lot of the food policy work in Toronto many years ago. I'm trying to imagine, now that we have recognized there's 64 councils, or roughly 64 councils across Canada, how do some of these smaller groups who are just really, as we all know in the not-for-profit sector, just doing the work and maybe not having the capacity or even the know-how and the resources to really look upstream, see what others have been doing and build that capacity, and wondering what the opportunities might be, or if there's a network for folks to plug into to be able to build that capacity. So that's my question.
Right. Yeah, I mean, definitely there are networks, and there are organizations, organizations like, Community Food Centers Canada and locally Food Chair and other kinds of organizations at the various local places who have been trying to support the evolution of these things and help them build capacity. And in British Columbia, and if, I don't know if there's anybody from BC on the call who can speak to this, but in British Columbia, the provincial government a number of years ago set up a grant program to help with capacity building, which I think had some significant influence on the landscape there, and why there are so many of these organizations now in BC. But definitely it's a struggle to move up the ladder, so to speak, to move up the categories. And a lot of the time it does depend on some other body providing capacity building grants, or some group within the existing local network doing the fundraising, which again is hard to do when you're in the middle of trying to do a whole bunch of other things. But somebody to get a grant to actually help with the capacity building so that they can deliberately move up the ladder. One of the things we were hoping for what we were hoping would happen with this report when it came out, and I don't actually know if this has happened, but this was our hope, was that it would allow groups to realize more clearly what they needed to do if they wanted to move up the ladder, so to speak. But again, whether that's happened, I don't know. It's definitely a challenge. It doesn't come automatically. Sometimes you got to get lucky. You got to find some kind of a benefactor that will help with that process.
Thank you.
I think you're muted, Michael.
I am, sorry. So I've had the pleasure of being able to provide some support for the York Region Food Network and the emerging York Region Food Council over the years. My role is knowledge mobilization, and with your experience across the country, how would you categorize the processes of like knowledge transfer from jurisdiction to jurisdiction? Are there pockets where it's working well? Is it generally a bit of a gap or a challenge? I'm just curious to know if you could provide any insight on that, please.
Yeah, well, I think it's worked relatively well on sort of the project program side. In other words, there are a lot of NGOs who have shared project and program design ideas. They've put out manuals, they've done webinars, they've done seminars, they've sometimes done traveling road shows. So they've been able to help different organizations across the country do their own version of something that's been successful somewhere else. And that's been hugely valuable. I think where things have been much weaker is the knowledge mobilization around policy advocacy. I would say in general, our ability to do really good food policy advocacy work is pretty limited, and there are a whole series of reasons for that, which we probably don't have time to get into today. But some of them I talk about on my website. But I think that's maybe our critical weakness around knowledge dissemination. And even though there are people who are very skilled at this and have attempted to help community organizations improve their policy advocacy work, for reasons that I don't fully understand, a lot of local organizations have been reluctant to use that knowledge that does exist out there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Don't have anyone else on the speakers list right now. I'm curious if there are any other questions. I am typing something in as while I'm waiting. As part of our series, we're very fortunate. On July 14, we have the Mayor of Aurora here in Ontario that's going to be talking about municipal policy making. It could be a great opportunity for anybody who's local within the Toronto area to learn a little bit more about municipal policy processes, but really kind of assert some direct questions specific to food security and food council development. Anything else going twice?
Well, I could just maybe briefly then follow up on my last answer and say a little bit more about this policy advocacy dilemma we're facing in the sector.
Thank you.
So understandably, most local food organizations and food councils, they have a lot of really good community organizers. They're very skilled at that and using food often as a community organizing vehicle. Now, often what happens, because local organizations don't have a lot of resources, is that while they're doing this community organizing work, they typically butt up against the policy system. In other words, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal rulemaking around food and food system activity, they typically run into that at some point, and it limits their ability to achieve their community mobilizing activities. And of course, people get frustrated. So then the organization says, well, we really do need to do some policy advocacy work so we can change the policy environment. But because the organizations often lack resources, understandably, given how difficult it is to fund this kind of work, often what happens is somebody who's already doing community organizing work gets assigned the task almost off the side of their desk of doing policy advocacy. And so understandably, because their skills are in community organizing, they approach policy advocacy work like a community organizer would approach their activities. And that usually fails because policy advocacy skills are a different set of skills from community organizing skills. And the way you interact with the policy realm and the policy actors is not the same as the way you necessarily interact with community members. So this work is undertaken usually unsuccessfully, and then everybody gets even more frustrated. So there are a number of challenges here, obviously, but one of the key ones is that, and I've alluded to this throughout my presentation, is that we really need to understand more clearly where decisions are being made. That's so fundamental to doing good policy advocacy work. And a lot of the time, the proposals that are coming forward from community organizations and even a lot of the local food councils, a lot of the proposals that come forward are pitched to the wrong place in the system. And of course, if you're a policy maker somewhere and you see a proposal that is really not targeted to you, then, or it's not within your realm of activity or jurisdiction, understandably, you ignore it. So we have to get much better at understanding where the decisions are being made, who's making them, what kind of factors are creating the decision, what kind of pressures the decision makers are under, and then figure out how to feed them proposals and not just general ideas on something. The proposals actually have to be really specific. There may have been a time when advocates could throw out a good idea, you know, the broad strokes of a good idea, and somebody would run with it. I don't think that happens much anymore. I mean, sometimes we get lucky and it happens, but now, unfortunately, we have to do often government's own work for it, which means we actually have to work up the details of the change process. Even though it's their realm, we actually have to do their work for them, because now so many people within government don't necessarily even understand the details of their own portfolios. And so it often becomes the role of some other actor to provide those details. Not that they'll necessarily use them all directly, but without the details, usually there's almost no chance of anything happening. So this is obviously a complicated agenda, but fundamental to it is that as a movement, as a food movement, we have to get better at policy advocacy work.
Thank you very much. And while you were speaking, Rod, there was a comment really kind of alluding to the vulnerability of funding from various levels of government that could really kind of, my assumption is really affect the capacity for advocating for effective change.
I mean, what I'm hoping will happen as we move forward is that we'll get closer to what some people called a more pluralistic approach to decision making, where governments will recognize there are certain things we as a government do well, and there are certain things we don't do so well, and they will say, okay, so we know that certain NGOs or certain business groups are really good at doing X, Y, and Z. So let's get more collaborative here. Let's not do this competitive, you have to pressure me in order for me to do something, which is what really dominates the system now. Everybody will get more collaborative, and we've seen certain examples of this over the years, but by and large, a lot of these relationships are competitive right now. So if they become more collaborative, then it becomes more feasible for governments to be comfortable providing resources to groups that are going to do certain things that they need done, but they can't actually do themselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're getting close to 2 o'clock. It seems an appropriate point to put an end. I certainly don't want to go over time, but on behalf of all the participants today, Professor MacRae, we want to thank you very much for your time and sharing your experience and insight. Also to the participants, thank you for making the time. It seems like the summer of webinars. There are a lot of options. We're very grateful for you making the time. We are going to post this on the Knowledge Mobilization website, and we'd be more than happy to forward a link to you when that is done. We'll send out an evaluation next week. As mentioned, this is going to be part of a rolling series, and we're all about continuous improvement. If you have thoughts, ideas, suggestions, we really appreciate it. Wishing everyone good health. Be well and be safe. Again, Dr. MacRae, thank you so much, but take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.